A nurse got fired for refusing corruption. In a hospital moments later, she gets a turnaround that shocked everyone. If you enjoy our content, consider subscribing to the channel. Your story starts now. The biting wind whipped across Linda Mercer's face as she trudged through the hospital parking lot, her breath forming clouds in the frigid January air. The snow crunched beneath her sensible shoes as she pulled her worn coat tighter around her tired frame. 12 hours on her feet had left her body aching, but it was the weight of what awaited her inside the administrator's office that truly burdened her shoulders. At 44, Linda's face carried the gentle lines of someone who smiled often, even when exhausted. Her auburn hair, streaked with dignified silver, was pulled back in a practical bun that had begun to loosen after her long shift. Despite the bone-deep fatigue, her green eyes remained alert, observant. The eyes of someone who had spent decades noticing the subtle changes in patients' conditions that others might miss. The hospital corridors were quieter at this hour. Most of the administrative staff had long since departed, leaving only the night shift to tend to the unending needs of the sick and injured. Linda's footsteps echoed against the linoleum as she made her way to Dr. Victor Harmon's office. "Come in," a clipped voice responded to her knock. Dr. Harmon sat behind his imposing mahogany desk, his silver hair perfectly coiffed despite the late hour. His suit was impeccable, not a wrinkle to be seen. He barely glanced up as Linda entered, his attention fixed on a patient file open before him. "Ah, Nurse Mercer, thank you for coming in before you left." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Please. Have a seat." Linda lowered herself into the chair opposite him, her body protesting the movement. "You wanted to see me, Dr. Harmon." He slid the file across the desk. "It's about Mr. Giannopoulos, the patient in 307. Linda immediately pictured the elderly Greek immigrant, his papery skin and kind eyes, the family photos his daughter had taped to the wall beside his bed. "Yes, I've been caring for him all week. His condition has stabilized, but there seems to be a discrepancy in his treatment record," Dr. Harmon interrupted, his voice unnaturally even. "According to this, he was administered 10 milligrams of lorazepam on Tuesday evening." Linda frowned. "That's not possible. Mr. Giannopoulos is on blood thinners. I would never have administered that dosage. It could have killed him. And yet here it is." Harmon tapped the document. "Your initials." Linda leaned forward, examining the form. The handwriting wasn't hers, though the forgery was clever. More disturbing was the date. She hadn't even been on duty that evening. "This isn't my handwriting, and I wasn't working Tuesday evening. I was home with my son. He had a college interview the next morning." The certainty in her voice was absolute. Dr. Harmon's expression hardened. "The hospital is facing a potential audit, Linda. Medicare reimbursement is at stake. Mr. Giannopoulos' care has exceeded what his coverage allows. These administrative errors need to be rectified." The implication hung in the air between them, crystallizing into something ugly and undeniable. "You want me to falsify medical records?" It wasn't a question. "I want you to correct an administrative oversight." His tone was measured, reasonable. "Everyone benefits. The hospital avoids unnecessary scrutiny, and patients like Mr. Giannopoulos continue to receive care without interruption." Linda felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter night. "That's not just unethical, Dr. Harmon, it's illegal. It's pragmatic," he countered. "Mr. Giannopoulos received excellent care. Care we might not be able to provide to others if Medicare cuts our reimbursements. Think of the greater good, Linda." For a moment, she thought of her mortgage, of Betty's college tuition, of all the practical concerns that kept her awake at night since Michael's death. The path of least resistance beckoned. Sign the form, go home, preserve the life she'd managed to rebuild. But then she thought of Mr. Giannopoulos, of his trust in her, of all the patients who placed their lives in her hands daily. She thought of Michael, who had loved her integrity above all else. "No." The word was quiet but firm. "I won't do it." Dr. Harmon's facade of collegiality evaporated. "You've been with this institution for nearly 20 years, Linda. This kind. Dove inflexibility doesn't serve anyone, least of all yourself. My answer is no. She stood, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten. If there's nothing else, I'd like to go home to my children. His expression was cold now, calculating. Very well. We'll discuss this again tomorrow when you've had time to consider the implications more thoroughly. Linda nodded stiffly and left the office, her heart pounding. As she drove home through the snow-covered streets of New York, the weight of her decision pressed against her chest. She had done the right thing. Of that she was certain. Yet the cost of that righteousness remained to be seen. Her small house was dark when she arrived, save for the porch light Betty had left on for her. Inside, the quiet was a balm to her frayed nerves. Norman's textbooks were scattered across the kitchen table, evidence of her son's late-night studying. Betty had left a plate of dinner in the microwave, covered with plastic wrap and accompanied by a note in her daughter's looping handwriting. Eat something, Mum. Love you. The simple kindness brought tears to Linda's eyes. She warmed the food, mechanically, her mind still in Dr. Harmon's office, still wrestling with the implications of what he'd asked of her. As she ate at the silent kitchen table, she found herself glancing at the photograph on the wall. Michael in his firefighter's uniform, his arm around her, both of them younger and unburdened by the knowledge of how quickly happiness could be, snatched away. "What would you do?" she whispered to the image of her late husband. The photograph offered no answers, only Michael's frozen smile and the memory of his unwavering moral compass. Linda slept fitfully that night, her dreams filled with administrative forms that multiplied endlessly, and patients whose faces morphed into Michael's as they flatlined before her. Morning came too soon, grey light filtering through her bedroom, curtains. She moved through her routine with the efficiency of long practice, shower, coffee, a quick breakfast eaten standing at the counter. Betty was already gone, her early class at the community college starting at 7. Norman appeared, as Linda was gathering her things, his lanky frame filling the kitchen doorway. "You look tired, Mom," he observed, his brow furrowed with the concern of a son who had grown up too quickly after his father's death. "Just a long shift," she assured him, forcing a smile. "How's the engineering project coming along?" "Good. I think I might actually have a shot at that scholarship." His cautious optimism warmed her heart. "Of course you do. You're brilliant." She reached up to straighten his collar, a maternal gesture that made him roll his eyes even as he smiled. "There's leftover lasagna in the fridge for dinner. I should be home by 7. Be careful out there. It's still icy." She nodded, touched by his concern. "Always am." The drive to the hospital was slower than usual, the roads treacherous with patches of black ice. Linda used the time to steel herself for whatever confrontation awaited. She would stand her ground, she decided. Some lines couldn't be crossed, no matter the consequences, but nothing could have prepared her for what she found upon arrival. Security met her at the staff entrance, a burly guard with an uncomfortable expression, and HR representative Diane Lawson, whose pinched face betrayed nothing. "Linda Mercer?" the guard asked unnecessarily. They'd worked in the same building for over a decade. "Yes, Bill, it's me," she answered, confusion evident in her voice. "I need your ID badge, please." His discomfort was palpable. Linda's stomach dropped. "What's going on?" Diane stepped forward, her voice professionally detached. "You're being placed on administrative leave pending an investigation into allegations of falsifying patient records and medication mismanagement." The accusation hit Linda like a physical blow. "That's absurd. I've never—" "Your personal belongings will be collected and sent to your home," Diane continued, as if Linda hadn't spoken. "Please surrender your badge and exit the premises immediately." Linda's hands trembled as she unclipped her ID. Around them, colleagues hurried past, avoiding eye contact, their hushed whispers following in her wake. The public humiliation was clearly by design, a warning to others who might consider defying administration. "This is wrong," Linda said quietly, handing over the badge that represented nearly 2 decades of her life. "And you know it, Diane." For a fleeting second, something like shame crossed the HR director's face before her professional mask slipped back into place. Security will escort you to your car." The walk back through the parking lot was the longest of Linda's life. Halfway there, her phone buzzed. A text from Sarah, a fellow nurse with whom she'd shared countless shifts. "What's happening? Rumors flying. Call me." Linda tucked the phone away without responding. What could she possibly say? Behind the wheel of her car, safe from prying eyes, she finally allowed herself a moment of pure, undiluted fear. Without her income, how would she manage the mortgage? Betty's tuition? Norman's scholarship chances were excellent, but they wouldn't cover everything. The savings she'd managed to accumulate after Michael's death were modest at best, depleted by the ongoing financial demands of single parenthood. More than the practical concerns, though, was the assault on her professional identity. For 22 years, being a nurse had defined her. She had held countless hands, wiped countless tears, fought tirelessly for patients who couldn't advocate for themselves. The thought that her reputation could be so easily destroyed made her physically ill. As the initial shock receded, anger took its place, a slow-burning, righteous fury that straightened her spine and dried her tears. Dr. Harmon had moved quickly, framing her before she could expose him. The realization that he had likely been falsifying records for some time, perhaps endangering patients in the process, hardened her resolve. She would fight this, not just for herself, but for Mr. Giannopoulos and all the others who trusted the system to protect them. At home, the empty house echoed with possibilities both terrifying and uncertain. Linda moved through the rooms like a ghost, attempting to process the seismic shift in her circumstances. By noon, she had formulated a plan. She would contact the nursing board, file a formal grievance, gather evidence of Dr. Harmon's directive. The system had safeguards for precisely this reason. Her optimism lasted until she made her first call and discovered that Dr. Harmon had already filed a report with the nursing board, presenting a damning narrative of medication errors and subsequent cover-up attempts on her part. The representative's tone turned from professional to chilly upon hearing her name. "We take patient safety very seriously, Ms. Mercer," the woman said. "Your case will be reviewed at the next board meeting. Until then, I suggest you retain legal counsel." Legal counsel. The words echoed in Linda's mind as she ended the call. Lawyers cost money, money she could ill afford to spend with her income suddenly cut off. The next blow came that evening when Betty returned from campus, her face ashen. "Mum, is it true?" Her daughter's voice trembled. "Professor Davis said her husband heard you were fired for changing patient records. He's on the hospital board." Linda closed her eyes briefly, absorbing this new humiliation. "No, honey, it's not true. I was put on leave because I refused to falsify records." Betty's relief was palpable but short-lived. "So you're not working? At all? For how long?" "I don't know yet." Linda tried to infuse her voice with a confidence she didn't feel. "But it'll be okay, we've faced worse." They both knew she was referring to Michael's death, the devastating loss that had forced them to rebuild their lives from the ground up. But this new challenge felt different. When Michael died, they had grieved together, supported by friends and community. Now, Linda sensed isolation closing in around them, a pariah status conferred by rumors and half-truths. That sense was confirmed over the following days, as calls to friends and colleagues went unanswered, or were met with awkward, brief conversations. Even at Norman's basketball game, Linda noticed the subtle shifting away, the averted gazes of other parents who had once chatted easily with her. The power of the hospital administration extended far beyond its walls, it seemed. Dr. Harmon wasn't just her boss. He was a prominent figure in the community, with connections that reached into local government, the school board, and various civic organizations. The narrative he constructed, that of a desperate nurse cutting corners and endangering patients, found fertile ground in a community predisposed to trust authority. 2 weeks into her administrative leave, Linda received the formal termination letter. The language was carefully crafted, citing violations of hospital policy and professional standards, without specifying details. The implication was clear, however. She was being branded as negligent, perhaps even dangerous. That night, after Betty and Norman had gone to bed, Linda sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by bills and dwindling bank statements. The practical reality of her situation was becoming increasingly stark. Without a reference from her long-term employer, finding another nursing position would be nearly impossible. The mortgage payment was due in 10 days, and Betty's tuition the week after. For the first time since Michael's death, Linda felt herself sinking into a despair that seemed to have no bottom. She had always prided herself on her resilience, on her ability to weather whatever storms life sent her way. But this systematic dismantling of everything she had built, tested the limits of that resilience. In bed that night, Linda stared at the ceiling, her mind racing with worst-case scenarios. Would they lose the house? Would Betty have to drop out of college? Would Norman's future be compromised because she had chosen principle over pragmatism? Sleep, when it finally came, offered little respite. Her dreams were a chaotic blend of hospital corridors that stretched endlessly and patient monitors that flatlined no matter what interventions she attempted. She woke unrested, her determination wavering in the cold light of day. Perhaps she thought she should call Dr. Harmon. Perhaps there was still a way to salvage something from this disaster, to offer a carefully worded apology, a tacit agreement to remain silent about what she knew. The very idea made her stomach turn, but desperation has a way of reshaping moral boundaries, of making the unthinkable suddenly viable. Linda was still wrestling with this internal dilemma when Norman knocked on her bedroom door, his face unusually serious. "Mom? There's someone here to see you." "Who?" She hadn't been expecting visitors. Her social circle had contracted dramatically since her dismissal. "He says his name is Kenneth Chen. He's a journalist." The name was vaguely familiar. Linda recalled reading his exposés in the city paper, detailed, meticulously researched pieces that often led to concrete reforms. What would someone like that want with her? Curiosity overcame her initial wariness. "Tell him I'll be right down." Kenneth Chen was younger than she had expected, perhaps in his early 30s, with intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He stood as she entered the living room, extending a hand in greeting. "Ms. Mercer, thank you for seeing me. I apologize for the unannounced visit." Linda shook his hand, studying him with the careful assessment she'd applied to countless patients over the years. "How did you find me?" "Your colleague Sarah Denton reached out to me. She thought I might be interested in what happened to you at Metropolitan General." His direct gaze held hers. "And I am." Sarah. The name brought a painful mixture of hope and caution. Linda gestured for him to sit. "What exactly did Sarah tell you?" "That you were terminated after refusing to falsify patient records at the administration's request." He took out a small recorder. "May I?" Linda hesitated, weighing the potential consequences against the relief of finally being heard. "Will you use my name?" "Not without your permission, but Ms. Mercer, if your story is as significant as I suspect, attaching your name to it gives it credibility that anonymity cannot." He was right, of course. Whistleblowers who remained in the shadows were easily dismissed, their claims attributed to personal grudges or professional jealousy. "All right," she said finally, "I'll tell you everything." For the next hour, Linda recounted her confrontation with Dr. Harmon, the subsequent termination, and the systematic campaign to discredit her professionally. Kenneth listened intently, occasionally asking for clarification, but mostly allowing her to tell her story uninterrupted. "Do you have any documentation?" he asked when she had finished. "Emails, text messages, anything that corroborates your account?" Linda shook her head. Dr. Harmon was careful. The conversation was private, and he never put his request in writing. Kenneth considered this challenge. What about colleagues who might have faced similar pressures, or patients whose records may have been altered? "I don't know." The admission was painful. "I suspected this wasn't the first time, but I had no proof." "Then we'll need to find some." Kenneth's determination was palpable. "Ms. Mercer, what you've described isn't just unethical, it's potentially criminal. Medicare fraud is a federal offense." The word criminal sent a jolt through Linda. She had been so focused on the personal and professional implications that she hadn't fully processed the legal ramifications of what Dr. Harmon had asked her to do. "I need to think about this," she said carefully. "My children—" "Of course." Kenneth stood, handing her his card. Take whatever time you need. But Ms. Mercer, you're not alone in this. Sarah isn't the only one who believes your version of events." After he left, Linda turned the business card over in her hands, considering the implications of going public. The potential for vindication was alluring, but the path to that vindication would be arduous and uncertain. The decision was still weighing on her mind later that evening when Betty returned from class, her expression troubled. "Mom, did you know tuition is due next week?" Linda's heart sank. "Yes, I know, don't worry about it." Betty's eyes, so like Michael's, saw through the assurance. "How are we going to pay it? And the mortgage? And everything else?" "I'm working on it," Linda replied, trying to project a confidence she didn't feel. "I have some savings and there are options we can explore." "Like what?" "I could drop to part-time and get more hours at the bookstore." "Absolutely not." Linda's tone brooked no argument. "Your education comes first. We'll figure this out together, but not at the expense of your future." Betty's frustration was evident, but she didn't push further. Instead, she hugged her mother tightly, a gesture that nearly broke Linda's composure. Later, alone in her room, Linda stared at Kenneth's card, weighing risks against principles, pragmatism against justice. The easy path, to remain silent, to seek another job, to somehow piece their lives back together without confronting the corruption directly, beckoned with its simplicity. But the image of Dr. Harmon continuing his practices, potentially endangering patients for financial gain, was too disturbing to dismiss. And there was her own professional reputation to consider, the decades of dedication reduced to whispers of negligence and fraud. With a deep breath, she made her decision. She would fight not just for herself, but for every patient whose trust had been violated, every healthcare professional pressured to compromise their integrity. She dialed Kenneth's number. "I'm in," she said when he answered. "Whatever it takes, I want the truth to come out." His response was immediate and resolute. "Then let's get to work." What followed was a methodical dismantling of the wall of silence surrounding Metropolitan General's administrative practices. Kenneth's investigative skills, combined with Linda's insider knowledge of hospital operations, proved a formidable combination. Sarah, emboldened by Linda's courage, provided crucial information about other instances of record falsification. A young resident physician, Dr. Maya Rodriguez, came forward with her own account of being pressured to adjust documentation related to Medicare claims. Bit by bit, a pattern emerged, a systematic effort to maximize reimbursements at the expense of accurate record-keeping. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, Diane Lawson, the HR director, who had escorted Linda from the building. Burdened by conscience and fearing her own complicity in potentially illegal activities, she provided Kenneth with internal memos that hinted at a broader awareness of the problem within the administration. 4 weeks after Linda's first meeting with Kenneth, his exposé was published on the front page of the city paper. "Profit over patients, allegations of fraud at Metropolitan General." The article was meticulous, presenting a damning picture of a hospital administration willing to jeopardize patient care for financial gain. Linda's account featured prominently. Her dedication and ethical stance contrasted starkly with the administrative pressure to compromise. The public response was immediate and overwhelming. Other healthcare workers began coming forward with similar stories from institutions across the city. Patient advocacy groups called for investigations. By the end of the week, the State Health Department had announced a formal inquiry into Metropolitan General's billing practices. For Linda, the vindication was bittersweet. The article had cleared her name professionally, but the damage to her financial stability remained. Job offers from other hospitals began to trickle in, but the immediate crisis of bills and tuition loomed large. It was in this moment of uncertainty that a new challenge emerged. Dr. Harmon, facing both public scrutiny and potential legal consequences, launched a counteroffensive. Through proxies and carefully placed comments, he began suggesting that Linda's motivations were less than pure, that she had been seeking financial gain through a lawsuit, that her nursing performance had been questionable for some time. More painfully, Former colleagues who had initially supported her began distancing themselves, fearful for their own positions. Even Sarah, who had been brave enough to speak to Kenneth, stopped returning Linda's calls after receiving a final warning about her job performance. The isolation that Linda had felt after her termination returned, now compounded by the very public nature of the conflict. At Norman's basketball game, other parents were openly hostile. One father loudly commenting that troublemakers who destroy institutions deserve whatever they get. Betty faced similar ostracism at college, where Professor Davis made pointed comments about appropriate channels and professional discretion while looking directly at her. The strain was beginning to show in their home life as well. Norman, typically stoic, lashed out when Linda suggested they might need to economize further. "Why did you have to make such a big deal out of this?" he demanded, his adolescent face flushed with emotion. "Why couldn't you just let it go?" The words stung, especially because a part of Linda had asked herself the same question during her darkest moments. "Because it was wrong, Norman. Sometimes you have to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult. Even if it costs us everything," he challenged. Betty intervened, her voice tired beyond her years. "Stop it, Norman. This isn't Mom's fault. She did the right thing." "The right thing?" Norman's laugh was bitter. "Tell that to my scholarship committee. Professor Davis's husband is the chair, and suddenly my application is under extended review." The revelation hit Linda like a physical blow. "Norman, why didn't you tell me?" "What would you have done?" he asked, deflating slightly. "It's not like you can fix it. None of us can fix any of this." That night, after her children had retreated to their rooms, Linda sat alone at the kitchen table, facing the starkest reality yet. Her principled stand might cost her children their futures. The thought was almost unbearable. For the first time she allowed herself to cry, deep, silent sobs that shook her body and released some fraction of the tension she had been carrying. The tears brought no solutions, but they cleared something. In her mind, creating space for a clarity that had been obscured by fear and uncertainty. She would not be broken by this. She would find a way forward, not just for herself but for Betty and Norman. Their futures were not collateral damage in some ethical war. They were the very reason she had to prevail. With renewed determination, Linda began to systematically address their most pressing concerns. She called Betty's college and arranged a payment plan for tuition. She reached out to Kenneth, who connected her with a lawyer willing to work pro bono on potential legal action against the hospital. She even swallowed her pride and applied for temporary financial assistance to ensure they wouldn't lose the house while she looked for work. Each step was difficult, each conversation requiring her to recount the humiliating details of her termination. But gradually, a path began to emerge through what had seemed an impenetrable thicket of problems. It was during this period of cautious rebuilding that Linda received an unexpected call. The number was unfamiliar, the voice on the other end hesitant. "Ms. Mercer, this is Teresa Giannopoulos. My father was a patient of yours at Metropolitan, Stavros Giannopoulos." Linda immediately recalled the elderly patient, whose records had been at the center of her confrontation with Dr. Harmon. "Yes, of course. How is your father doing?" "He passed away last week." Teresa's voice broke slightly. His heart, finally, gave out. "I'm so sorry for your loss." The news brought a fresh wave of sadness. "He was a wonderful man." "He was." Teresa paused. "Miss Mercer, before he died, my father told me something concerning about his time at Metropolitan. He said his chart showed medications he never received, treatments that never happened. When I questioned the staff, they dismissed it as confusion, but my father was sharp until the end." Linda's pulse quickened. "Mrs. Giannopoulos, would you be willing to share that information with the journalist who wrote the article about Metropolitan? It could be important." "That's why I'm calling. I saw your name in the article and I remembered how kind you were to my father. He trusted you." Teresa's voice strengthened with resolve. "I want to help." Teresa's testimony provided Kenneth with a crucial new angle for his investigation, the human cost of administrative fraud. The follow-up article, featuring Stavros Giannopoulos' story, resonated deeply with readers. Letters to the editor poured in, many from families with similar experiences at various institutions. The tipping point came when a group of nurses from Metropolitan, led by Sarah, who had apparently reconsidered her silence, staged a public demonstration in support of patient safety and ethical healthcare administration. The image of healthcare workers in uniform, standing in silent protest outside the hospital, was powerful enough to make national news. Under mounting pressure from media, regulatory bodies, and the public, Metropolitan General's Board called an emergency meeting. 3 days later, they announced Dr. Harmon's resignation to pursue other opportunities and a comprehensive review of the hospital's administrative practices. For Linda, the vindication was profound but incomplete. Her name had been cleared, but her financial situation remained precarious. Job interviews had yielded sympathetic responses, but no concrete offers. Her very public whistleblowing had made her a liability in many administrators' eyes, regardless of their personal feelings about the case. It was in this moment of professional limbo that Linda received another unexpected phone call, this one from Dr. Elena Patel, a former colleague who had left Metropolitan years earlier to establish her own community health clinic in an underserved neighborhood. "Linda, I've been following what happened," Eleanor said without preamble. "I always knew Victor Harmon was trouble, but what he did to you was unconscionable." "Thank you for saying that," Linda replied, warmed by the unsolicited support. "It means a lot. I'm not calling just to offer moral support, though Lord knows you deserve it." Elena's voice took on a note of tentative excitement. "I have a proposition for you. My clinic is expanding. We've received grant funding to open a second location focusing on geriatric care. I need someone to run it, someone with experience, integrity, and a genuine commitment to patient welfare." The implication hung in the air for a moment before Elena continued. "I can't offer what Metropolitan paid you, at least not initially, but it would be a chance to build something meaningful, something that prioritizes care over profit margins." Linda's mind raced with possibilities, a leadership role, a fresh start, work that aligned perfectly with her values. "I'm interested," she said, her voice steadier than it had been in weeks. "Very interested." "Good," Eleanor replied, the smile evident in her voice, "because we need to move quickly. The funding requires us to be operational within 2 months, and we're starting from scratch, location, staffing, everything." The challenge was daunting but exhilarating in its potential. "When can we meet to discuss details?" "Tomorrow morning? My office in Brooklyn. I'll text you the address." After ending the call, Linda sat motionless, absorbing the sudden shift in her circumstances. For weeks, she had been fighting merely to survive, to keep her head above the rising waters of financial disaster and professional disgrace. Now, unexpectedly, a door had opened to something more. Not just employment, but purpose. The conversation with Betty and Norman that evening was the most animated they'd had since the ordeal began. Both children responded to Linda's cautious optimism with relief and encouragement. "It's perfect for you, Mum," Betty exclaimed. "You've always said the system needs to change. Now you can actually build something better." Norman, still struggling with his scholarship situation but visibly lifted by the positive development, nodded in agreement. "Plus, it's a leadership position. That's a promotion from what you were doing before." Linda tempered their enthusiasm with pragmatism. "The pay will be less, at least initially, and it's going to be an enormous amount of work to get it up and running in the time frame they need." "We'll help," Betty said immediately. "I can cut back on some of my electives this semester." "Absolutely not," Linda interrupted. "Your education remains the priority. But," she added, softening, "I might take you up on some administrative help on weekends, both of you." The meeting with Elena the next morning confirmed both the challenges and the opportunities of the position. The new clinic would focus on providing holistic care to elderly patients, combining medical services with social support, nutrition counseling, and preventative health education. Linda would have significant autonomy in shaping the approach, hiring staff and establishing protocols. "I want to be clear about something," Eleanor said, as they reviewed the preliminary budget. "I chose you for this role because of what happened At Metropolitan, not in spite of it, I need someone who will stand firm on ethical issues, even when it's difficult. Linda's throat tightened with unexpected emotion. After weeks of being defined by her whistleblowing in the most negative terms, to have it framed as an asset was profoundly validating. "I won't let you down," she promised. The next 6 weeks passed in a blur of activity, finding a suitable location for the clinic, navigating the Byzantine process of health department approvals, drafting job descriptions, and interviewing potential staff. Each task brought its own challenges and small victories. Linda threw herself into the work with an energy that surprised even her. The focus and purpose it provided was healing in a way that nothing else could have been. Here was an opportunity to build something from the ground up, something that embodied the values she had sacrificed so much to uphold. Betty and Norman, true to their word, pitched in whenever their schedules allowed. Betty's organizational skills proved invaluable in setting up the clinic's filing systems, while Norman's technical knowledge helped establish the basic IT infrastructure. Even Kenneth contributed, writing a thoughtful piece about the new clinic for the health section of the paper, framing it as a positive development emerging from the Metropolitan scandal. As the opening date approached, however, new complications arose. Dr. Harmon, though officially resigned from Metropolitan, remained influential in New York's medical community. Suppliers mysteriously backed out of contracts. Potential referring physicians became suddenly unavailable. A scheduled inspection was delayed without explanation. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidental. Eleanor, normally unflappable, expressed her frustration during a late-night planning session. "He's still trying to punish you," she concluded, pacing the small office they had established in the nearly completed clinic. "This is deliberate sabotage." Linda nodded, bone-tired but resolute. "He can't stand that I've landed on my feet. The narrative was supposed to end with my professional destruction, not with this." She gestured around the space that was rapidly taking shape as a warm, welcoming healthcare facility. "What do we do?" Elena asked. "We're already behind schedule because of these delays, and the grant has specific milestones we need to meet." Linda considered the question carefully. The easy answer, to publicly accuse Dr. Harmon of interference, would likely backfire, making them appear unprofessional and reinforcing the troublemaker narrative he had worked hard to establish. "We adapt," she said finally. "If suppliers won't work with us, we find alternatives. If inspectors are being delayed, we go above their heads. If referring physicians are hesitant, we build relationships with new ones." Eleanor's expression was doubtful. "That's a lot of extra work, Linda." "Yes," Linda acknowledged, "but it's worth it. What we're building here matters too much to let someone like Victor Harmon derail it." The strategic pivot required even more hours, even more creative problem-solving. Linda found herself working late into the night, researching alternative suppliers, making calls to regulatory officials, networking with healthcare providers across the city. The exhaustion was beginning to take a physical toll: headaches, disrupted sleep, a persistent tension in her shoulders that no amount of stretching seemed to alleviate. But each small triumph, a new contract secured, a regulatory hurdle cleared, provided the momentum to continue. 3 days before the scheduled opening, a final, potentially devastating obstacle emerged. The malpractice insurance company they had been working with suddenly withdrew their offer of coverage, citing unspecified risk factors associated with the clinic's leadership. Without malpractice insurance, they couldn't legally operate. The timing of the withdrawal, so close to their opening when alternatives would be nearly impossible to arrange, bore all the hallmarks of Dr. Harmon's influence. Elena's composure finally cracked. "This is it, isn't it? He's won." Linda refused to accept defeat. There has to be another option, some company that isn't connected to his network of influence. In 3 days? In New York? Linda, be realistic. In the stillness that followed, Elena's words, Linda felt the weight of all their work, all their hopes balanced precariously on the edge of collapse. The clinic, nearly finished, painted in warm, welcoming colors, equipped with comfortable furniture designed specifically for elderly patients, represented not just her professional redemption, but a genuine alternative to the profit-driven healthcare that had corrupted Metropolitan. "No," she said finally, her voice quiet but firm. "I won't accept that." Elena sighed, rubbing her temples. "Linda, I admire your determination, but we have to be practical, without malpractice insurance." "I know someone," Linda interrupted, an idea taking shape. "Michael's brother, James. He works for a small insurance company that specializes in high-risk policies. They might be outside of Harmon's sphere of influence." "High risk means expensive," Elena pointed out. "It's worth a try," Linda insisted. "What other choice do we have?" The call to her brother-in-law was difficult. They hadn't spoken often since Michael's death, their grief creating a distance that neither had fully bridged. But James listened intently as Linda explained their situation, the urgency evident in her voice. "Let me make some calls," he said after a thoughtful silence. "No promises, Linda, but I'll do what I can." The hours that followed were excruciating. Linda and Eleanor continued preparing for the opening as if the insurance issue would be resolved, neither willing to voice the fear that all their work might be for nothing. It was nearly midnight when James called back. "I've got something," he said without preamble. "It's not ideal. The premium is higher than what you had arranged, and the coverage has some limitations. But it would get you operational while we work on a more permanent solution." Linda closed her eyes, relief washing through her. "James, I don't know how to thank you." "No thanks necessary," he replied, his voice softening. "Michael would be proud of what you're doing, Linda. He always said you were the most principled person he knew." The mention of her late husband brought unexpected tears. "I miss him," she whispered. "We all do," James acknowledged. "I'll email the paperwork tonight. You'll need to sign it first thing tomorrow to have coverage in place for your opening." True to his word, the documents arrived in her inbox an hour later. The terms were indeed less favorable than their original arrangement, but they were viable. A lifeline thrown at the 11th hour. The clinic opened on schedule, a modest ceremony attended by local community leaders, healthcare advocates, and a surprisingly large contingent of former Metropolitan patients, including Teresa Giannopoulos. Kenneth covered the event for the paper, his article highlighting the clinic's innovative approach to geriatric care and its commitment to ethical healthcare practices. Dr. Harmon's final attempt at sabotage had failed. The East Brooklyn Senior Wellness Center was officially operational. The first month was challenging in ways Linda hadn't anticipated. Patient volume started lower than projected, as referring relationships were still being established. Staff, mostly idealistic young healthcare workers drawn to the clinic's mission, required more guidance than she had budgeted time for. The administrative demands of running a healthcare facility, from compliance documentation to supply management, consumed hours she had hoped to spend on direct patient care. Yet despite these challenges, something remarkable was happening. Word was spreading through the community about the clinic's approach, the unhurried appointments, the focus on preventative care, the genuine respect shown to elderly patients who were too often treated as burdens by the healthcare system. Midway through the second month, they reached a milestone. Their schedule was fully booked for the first time. Eleanor celebrated by bringing champagne to their weekly planning meeting. "To new beginnings," she toasted, raising her paper cup. Linda smiled, clinking her cup against Elena's, "and to doing things the right way." As spring yielded to summer, the clinic's reputation continued to grow. Their local news station ran a feature on their innovative program connecting isolated seniors with volunteer companions. Referrals increased steadily, necessitating the hiring of additional staff. Even the financial picture was improving, with the higher-than-expected patient volume offsetting the costlier insurance premiums. For Linda, the professional satisfaction was profound. Here was meaningful work that aligned perfectly with her values, work that made a tangible difference in people's lives. The personal satisfaction, however, was equally significant. Betty and Norman had watched her stand firm in her principles, weather the consequences, and ultimately emerge stronger, a living example of the values she had always tried to instill in them. Betty, inspired by her mother's experience, changed her educational focus from general business to healthcare administration, determined to be part of reforming the system from within. Norman, whose scholarship had eventually been approved after intervention from a sympathetic board member, found himself drawn to bioethics courses alongside his engineering studies. It was Norman who brought the news that would mark the beginning of the final chapter in the Metropolitan saga. "Mom," he called, bursting into the kitchen one evening in early October, his laptop clutched under his arm. "You need to see this." He opened the computer, revealing a breaking news story. Metropolitan General under federal investigation for Medicare fraud. Linda sat heavily in the nearest chair, scanning the article with growing astonishment. The state inquiry triggered by Kenneth's reporting had uncovered sufficient evidence to warrant a full federal investigation into Metropolitan's billing practices. Dr. Harmon, though no longer employed by the hospital, was specifically named as a person of interest. "They're finally going to be held accountable," Norman said, his voice reflecting his mother's own mix of vindication and disbelief. Linda nodded, unable to articulate the complex emotions coursing through her. After months of struggling to rebuild her life while Dr. Harmon seemingly escaped consequences, justice was finally catching up. The federal investigation moved with deliberate thoroughness, interviewing dozens of current and former Metropolitan employees. Linda spent a full day with investigators, recounting her experience in painstaking detail. The process was emotionally draining but cathartic, a formal acknowledgement that her stand had been justified. 6 weeks later, the U.S. Attorney's Office announced criminal charges against Dr. Harmon and 2 other former administrators, citing a systematic pattern of fraudulent billing practices that had potentially cost taxpayers millions. Metropolitan General, now under new leadership, agreed to a substantial settlement and comprehensive reforms of its administrative practices. The day the charges were announced, Linda received an unexpected visitor at the clinic. Sarah Denton, her former colleague who had initially supported her before withdrawing under pressure. "I should have done more," Sarah said without preamble, her eyes downcast. "I knew what you were saying was true, but I was afraid." Linda gestured for her to sit. "Fear is a powerful motivator," she acknowledged, "but you did come forward eventually. That mattered." Sarah shook her head. "Not soon enough, not like you did." "We each have our own path," Linda replied gently. "The important thing is that the truth came out, and changes are being made." As Sarah left, visibly relieved by Linda's forgiveness, Eleanor observed from the doorway, "You're more generous than I would be." Linda considered this. It's not really about generosity. Holding on to resentment doesn't serve any purpose. We're building something better here. That's what matters now. The clinic continued to thrive as winter settled over the city. Of the bite. Federal case against Dr. Harmon proceeded methodically, with occasional updates appearing in the news. Linda followed these developments with interest, but increasingly found her focus drawn to the future rather than the past. When she received a call from Metropolitan's new chief medical officer, Dr. Lydia Washington, the request caught her by surprise. "Ms. Mercer, I'm hoping you might consider consulting with us on our administrative reforms," Dr. Washington explained. "Your perspective would be invaluable as we restructure our processes." The irony was not lost on Linda. The institution that had so thoroughly rejected her now sought her expertise. Her initial impulse was to refuse, to maintain the emotional distance she had carefully established. But the request presented an opportunity she hadn't anticipated, the chance to help reshape policies at a major institution, potentially affecting thousands of patients and healthcare workers. "I'd need to maintain my position at the clinic," she stipulated after careful consideration. "This would have to be on a very limited basis." "Of course," Dr. Washington agreed readily. "We're looking for guidance, not a full-time commitment." "And," she added, "the position comes with a formal apology from the board for your treatment under the previous administration." The consulting role began in January, requiring Linda to balance her clinic responsibilities with periodic meetings at Metropolitan. The experience was surreal at first, walking the same corridors where she had once been escorted out in disgrace, now treated with deference by administrators who sought her input on ethical guidelines and compliance protocols. Some staff avoided her, clearly uncomfortable with the reminder of the institution's recent troubles. Others, particularly younger nurses and residents, approached her with quiet admiration, seeking advice on navigating their own ethical dilemmas within the system. By spring, the dual roles had settled into a manageable rhythm. The clinic continued to expand its services, now offering specialized programs for dementia patients and their caregivers. Metropolitan was slowly rebuilding its reputation under Dr. Washington's leadership, with Linda's input helping to shape a more transparent, patient-centered approach. Dr. Harmon's trial concluded in May, resulting in a conviction on multiple counts of fraud and a substantial prison sentence. The news brought a complicated sense of closure. Not triumph exactly, but a validation of the stance that had cost Linda so much. On a warm evening in early June, Linda sat on her back porch, watching as Betty and Norman prepared dinner together in the kitchen, their good-natured bickering drifting through the open window. Betty had just completed her junior year with honors, her internship at a healthcare advocacy organization already secured for the summer. Norman was thriving in his engineering program, his recent interest in medical device design merging his technical skills with a newfound passion for improving patient care. Linda's gaze drifted to Michael's photograph on the side table, a different one now, showing him laughing at a family picnic rather than in his formal uniform. "They're doing well," she told him softly. "We all are." The journey from that cold, January night in Dr. Harmon's office to this moment of hard-earned peace had been arduous, filled with losses and unexpected turns. Yet sitting here with the evening sun warming her face and the voices of her children reaching her through the open window, Linda felt a profound sense of rightness, of having stayed true to herself through the darkest times and emerged not just intact but stronger. The clinic would continue to grow, providing the kind of care she had always believed in. Metropolitan would hopefully become a better institution under its new leadership, and her children had witnessed firsthand the power of standing firm in one's principles, a lesson more valuable than any she could have taught through words alone. As Norman called her in for dinner, Linda took one last look at Michael's photograph. "We made it," she whispered, and rose to join her family, stepping confidently into the future they were building together. At the table, Betty raised her glass in an impromptu toast. "To Mom," she said, her eyes bright with pride, "who showed us what courage really looks like." Norman raised his own glass. "To doing the right thing even when it's the hardest thing." Linda felt her heart swell as she looked at her children, these remarkable young adults who had weathered the storm alongside her and emerged with their compassion and integrity not just intact but strengthened. "To all of us," she amended, including them in the toast, "and to new beginnings." Their glasses clinked together in the warm kitchen light, the sound a perfect note of celebration and promise. Outside, summer twilight settled over the neighborhood, wrapping the small house in gentle shadows. Inside, three people who had faced down injustice and uncertainty sat together, sharing a meal and planning for tomorrow. It was enough. It was everything.